Okay, so as promised, a very quick whistle-stop tour of some of the openings. It's going to take quite a few videos to go through all this. And as I said, because of two reasons, partly because of my lack of knowledge of some of the openings. Obviously, the ones I play, I know quite well. Those that I don't, not so much. So partly because of that, and partly because this whole thing is designed really for helping just beginners and newer players. I'm not going to even try to go into any of these in huge depth. It just doesn't seem appropriate. It's really just, say, a whistle-stop tour to give the new players some idea of some of the most common openings and what the first few moves might be, maybe some of the typical ideas. And so this video, we're going to look at the possibilities after both sides open with their king's pawn. So move one, white plays e4, black plays e5. So we're going to do PowerPoint with the two most common, and then we'll just go on to the 365 chess and just have a quick look using their analysis board at some of the other options. But we'll look at PowerPoint for the two most common ones with e4, e5, and the first one is called the Ruy Lopez, sometimes called the Spanish game because it's named after a Spanish priest called Ruy Lopez, and there he is on a Cuban stamp, so goodness knows if it's an accurate likeness, who knows. So Ruy Lopez, very common. It's been analysed by grandmasters and computers to variations 20-30 moves deep. And we're just, it's ridiculous. We can't possibly try to memorize all that as beginners. So we're just going to look at the first 3 or 4 moves and some of the basic ideas. So, okay, so here's what we have. So we begin with e4. Black will play e5. Remember, everything in this video is going to be e4, e5. Knight to f3, knight to c6, and now bishop to b5. And this is the basic setup for the Ruy Lopez. Black's got various possible replies that get tried. A6, putting a question to the bishop. Bishop to c5. Knight to f6 and f5. And there's a few other moves. Of course, there's plenty of other moves, but those, I think it's fair to say, are probably the most common. I'm not being an e4 player. I'm not a massive expert on the Lopez by any stretch of the imagination, but I think that's right. I do remember when I was at school, won't say how long ago that was, goodness me, our chess teacher saying not to play d6. He always said it was a bit too passive because you pinned your own knight, but okay, fine. So the most common possibility here is a6. That's what gets played more often than not. And then white has 2 options. One is just to put the bishop back to a4, and then normal development will happen. So you'll have perhaps, oh look, there's an extra bishop in the diagram. That one on f1 shouldn't be there. That's not there. Just ignore that. What you'll get is knight to f6. Perhaps white will castle. The knight takes e4 is not really a threat because rook e1 is nasty on the e file. So that's a possibility. Another option that white can try is bishop takes knight, the exchange variation, and after pawn takes bishop, it's a pretty even game. So black has had the pawns messed up a little bit on the queen side, but in return has the bishop pair on the open board. And that's not white's most popular. Certainly bishop a4 is the most popular. The other thing to note, if white plays bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, knight takes e5, doesn't actually win a pawn because the black queen can come down to d4, and that's a fork on the knight and this pawn, and actually gives black quite a nice game. So, okay, so bishop a4 tends to be the move that's played. So let's put these moves on the board. So e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, a6, bishop a4, knight f6, press pause, by the way, if you want to put this on your own board. Castles, bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3 and d6, c3, castles, h3, bishop b7, d4, rook e8. And there's so many other options all the way through this. It's just one typical line. And what you'll get, you'll see there's a fight going on for the center. Both sides are castled. Oh, another diagram error. Look, on G1, that should be a white king. Obviously hadn't had enough coffee the morning I made this one. And yeah, so black might play knight to a5, might play c5, really challenge for the center. White possibly going to drop the bishop back to c2 if need be. It has the option of swapping on e5, has the option of pushing with the pawn to d5, even a4. We'll do something with this knight as well, maybe knight to d2 to f1. There's just so much that both sides can do. Plenty of play for both sides. So very, very, very safe and sensible opening, the Ruy Lopez. So, okay, so you could go off and play some games with the Ruy Lopez, or we can do a different share, because that's not the only option. There we go. Oh, we have another option, which is very commonly played, called the Gioco Piano. And that's the Italian for quiet game. Gioco pianissimo if you really, really play negatively in this one. Oh, that's not negatively, solidly, should we say. That means really quiet game. And so what happens in this one? So the first moves are e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop c4, and there's other moves for black on move 3. Bishop c5 is probably safest. If black wants to play knight to f6 instead of bishop c5, then you get the fried liver variation after knight g5, which is just carnage. I think if you look at the opening database, there's almost never a draw when you play that one. It's just somebody wins. So that's quite entertaining. Anyway, the Gioco Piano, you've got both sides pointing pieces at f2 and f7. The fight for the center goes on. And what can happen? Well, white can play super safe, knight to c3, even d3. Very, very safe, just simple symmetrical development. And that's absolutely fine for white, especially as a beginner, because you can't really go wrong. Of course, the only problem with that is it means black has a really easy life too. White can castle, which is, of course, absolutely fine. And it just is a little bit more flexible, because then you've still got the option maybe of playing c3 or maybe a late Evans gambit, who knows. So there's options for white. Anything that's sensible development's fine. Where you can be a bit brave as white is you can try the Evans gambit that I just mentioned, which is this pawn to b4. And black now has to do something because the bishop's attacked. Perfectly reasonable just to put the bishop back if black isn't keen to get into the complications. But if bishop takes b4, then c3, bishop to a5, and after white either castles first or plays d4 immediately, but all kinds of things are going on in the middle of the board. So there's lots of stuff on the internet about the Evans gambit that you can look up if you want to. So the Gioco Piano, very, very quiet if you want it to be, a little bit more risky if you want to play in that way. Nothing wrong with it at all. An alternative third move for white, so we've looked at bishop b5 and bishop c4, is, so e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, is to play d4, which is known as the Scotch game. And again, perfectly good, perfectly reasonable for both sides, depending on how the play proceeds. Black's best move seems to be just to play pawn takes pawn, but not knight takes pawn, because knight takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and suddenly white's just got a really nice center and a lead in development, and there's no easy way to kick the queen away from d4. So pawn takes is good, and then white has choices. Yeah, white can recapture with the knight, nothing wrong with that. White can play bishop to c4. You can even play c3 and just sacrifice a pawn altogether. So that would be the Scotch game. Again, perfectly good for both sides, but a little less safe, should we say, considerably less safe than the Gioco Piano. And there's a few other options for both sides. So I'm going to go to the analysis board, and we'll just have a little look at some of the options. So we've said this video is about e4, e5, so that's what happens. So other things that can happen: white may not play knight f3. There's alternatives. There's f4, which is the king's gambit, but I think I'll do a video another time about some of the different gambits. So we'll leave that one for the time being. Just in brief, Black will normally play pawn takes pawn, white will play knight to f3, and you get quite an interesting game. It's very, how can we put it, romantic attacking chess, but perfectly sound. There's nothing wrong with it at all. Other things that can happen after knight f3, well, black doesn't have to play knight to c6. We have knight to f6, the Petrov defense, which is perfectly reasonable, the symmetrical defense. You'll get moves like knight takes e5, and black will kick the knight away. The knight has to go back, and then black can immediately recover the pawn. If I just go back a move, you'll see on this one a very high percentage of drawn games in the Petrov defense. So that's absolutely a possibility. What else could happen after knight f3? You can have d6, the Philidor defense. White with best play probably gets the better of that. It's a little bit passive. So normally white would win 40% of the games, give or take, at master level, but the rate is up to 48, 49. So that's okay, but maybe not the best for black. I can't think that there's anything else. What we're definitely not going to play is f6, which is just horrid after knight takes, pawn takes, and queen h5, and all that's going on. So, okay. The other alternative that is personal favorite of mine is f5. And this is the very, very risky Latvian gambit. And what you'll see, if white doesn't quite get this right, the odds really can tip in favor of black. It's very, very dangerous in blitz games if white doesn't quite know what's going on. However, if white knows the best way to deal with it, then you'll find it's it's perfectly good for white. So just the main line would be knight takes there, queen there, d4, d6. The knight has to retreat, not to f3, which would be a mistake, but to there. You'll get takes, takes, queen to g6, and there's all sorts of fun and games going on here. A good possibility for white is bishop e2 because it's threatening this nasty pin. Black might have to play knight here to defend that square. You're going to get some really quite chaotic positions in the various main lines of the Latvian. But again, I'll go through that in a separate one about gambits because it's quite good fun. Now, white doesn't have to play knight f3. There's alternatives. Bishop c4 is playable. Nothing wrong with that at all. It's just sound, safe development, bishop's game. The Vienna game, knight c3, is perfectly good. Nothing wrong with it at all. If you keep an eye on the percentages down there, you'll see there's perfectly good. White's hovering around the 40% mark. Knight f6, f4 leads to some rather entertaining games. So nothing wrong with that. You could have the four knights game, where instead of playing the bishop out, white simply brings out the knight. And again, nothing wrong with it. Nothing wrong with it at all. After knight f6, both sides have just developed sensibly, and you get the usual kind of pattern, sort of 40, 30, 30-ish, give or take. I don't think there's a great deal else. White can play the center game. Again, perfectly reasonable way to go. Black should just take, oops, I think I've hidden part of the screen there. Black should just take, but then the best thing for white to do, white can either play queen takes d4 is absolutely fine. Knight to f3, just delaying recapturing the pawn is fine. Or if you feel really entertaining as white, you can play c3. And now you've got a proper gambit, because if black wants to take on this square, you can have all sorts of fun and games. So bishop to c4, c takes b2, and now bishop takes b2, and look at this huge lead in development, but in return for 2 pawns. And it's probably it's probably good for black with best play, and the computer is saying minus 0.89, minus 0.38. You said, but black's 2 pawns up. So white clearly gets a lot of compensation. So that's possible. And I don't think there's a great deal else. You can play very solid, safe with d3 and sort of turn it into what's called a King's Indian attack by the back door. And then depending on what black does, black actually gets quite a good game if you do it with this move order. So probably not the best idea. What else? c3 is doable. but again, black scores quite highly there, so probably not the best move for white to play. And I think that's really about it. You won't see strange moves like queen to h5 are just not very good. Queen to h5 will just get dealt with by knights coming out. Bishop to c4 looks like it might be a mate threat, but after g6, all that happens is white's just wasted an awful lot of time. Some of the moves that have been played, by the way, just once because they're dreadful. I mean, someone in a master game has played knight f3, just immediately blundering the queen, which is quite funny. So there we go. So that's the whistle-stop tour of what happens after e4, e5. Probably safest for the beginner players to play knight f3, knight c6, and then the classical Ruy Lopez, bishop e5, a4, bishop a4, and we move on with development. Or if you so feel inclined, the gioco piano, and again, just moving on with development, and then you've got lots of different options, castles, knight c3, c3. I seem to recall when I was young, I played queen e2 a couple of times, but that doesn't seem to be anywhere on the list. Oh yeah, queen e2, there it is. It's been played by masters. C3 is probably the most common move. Okay, I think that covers just about everything in very, very brief for openings with 1e4, e5, and I will be back at some point with what black can do instead of replying with e5 against e4. So we'll look next at the French, the Sicilian, the Caracan, and possibly a couple of other options. Thanks for now.